Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Annette Campbell-Anderson. I am the Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. And I believe that school cell phone bans are a great first effort to try to wrangle in all of the device mania that has made schools highly distractible. But I also think that we now need to move into a second phase of this where we're really thinking about civility education when it comes to digital devices and technology as well. So more digital character education, I think, is the next phase of how we should be approaching our work here.
All right. Well, that's a great way to get us started. Can you tell us a little bit about when did you first start to think about the impact of mobile devices in schools?
Actually, March 13th, 2020. And I remember that date specifically because it was the date that our schools closed, supposedly for 2 weeks. And we were being told that the pandemic at that time was going to close our local schools for 2 weeks. And so we were advised to go to our schools and pick up paper packets for the 2 week period, the duration of the 2 week period, so that we would be able to make sure that our children could keep up with their schoolwork. And at that time, I thought, my gosh, when we went to the school to pick up those packets, they were humongous, like, book size, workbook size documents. And I thought, there's no way that my kiddos are going to be able to do all of this work. And we have all this technology. Why haven't we thought about, using it to actually do schoolwork? And so I think what you saw then was this gradual progression across the United States as districts closed everywhere, where people were trying to figure out, like, how do we do this? How do we have school online, virtually? And so, when we were thinking about those things, we were also thinking about, well, how much access to technology is good? Should we have some kind of hybrid version? There were all kinds of conversations about this. So I would say that one of the things that we realized was that there were some households where kids were using cell phones all day, not just for personal use, but they were using those devices as well for their schoolwork. And in some homes, there was one phone that was being used amongst siblings. And so the question became like, well, how long are kids going to have access to these devices? And is it healthy for them to do that? So fast forward to the end of the pandemic, right? So we pushed these devices into kids' hands and said, this is what we should be doing. And then I think what we saw at the end of the pandemic is, as our students transitioned back to in-person learning, I think we realized that, oh my goodness, these kids are so addicted to these phones. What's really happening with this? So I think that's where we really started to say, maybe we have gone too far in letting kids have so much access to these cell phones. But I really think it really started at the beginning of the pandemic.
I want to ask because this is a really complicated set of questions. I think almost everybody living in society right now has some sort of relationship to a mobile device. And I would argue that almost everybody's is imperfect. Nobody would say, yes, my relationship to my device is perfectly healthy and I love it. But kids are a little bit different. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of mobile habits for the average young person? When do people start to get them? How do they use them? How long do they use them? What are the things that they use on them?
So I would say that we know that about 95% of all teenagers have cell phones, and about 40% of middle schoolers in grades 6 through 8 have access to cell phones. The numbers are much lower in elementary school. I think many elementary school parents have decided, or are increasingly deciding, that access to cell phones should wait until 8th grade or age 8, or even until they get to high school. So you're seeing some parental pushing in there around when they feel kids should have access to those phones. But I think when you start looking at how much time kids are spending on phones, that's where the concerns really crop up. So it started to really be a peer pressure issue, right? If someone in your class had a cell phone, then you felt like you needed to have a cell phone. And so many parents felt conflicted about this. We've had smartphones for many years, but the issue I think also happens to be that as adults, we are coming up in this cell phone age alongside our kids. And so we have not ourselves really had much exposure to what a good finite amount of time is to be on the phones all day so that we know how to manage that with our kids. And so that's, I think, part of the dilemma that we find ourselves in is that adults are spending too much time actually on their cell phones as well and on all of these mobile devices. And so there hasn't been really much attention to this because I think, the grown-ups in this case have been learning alongside the kids. And also, as I said, the pandemic was really a tipping point for when people really started spending so much more time with this technology, such that, the previous Surgeon General said that, we now have a loneliness epidemic because so many people are spending so much time on these devices.
Dr. Anderson, can you give us a sense of like, before you ban phones in schools, what's the normal day-to-day like? I think for a lot of listeners, they probably haven't necessarily been in the era where cell phones were ubiquitous. I know the iPhone came out when I was a senior in college, right? So what's that experience like when you're walking through the halls of a normal high school? What does it feel like when you haven't banned phones, when phones are perfectly normal and accessible?
Well, what you hear from school administrators and classroom teachers is frustration about having access to the phones all day long. Because, for one, kids are spending on average about 5.5 hours a day on these cell phones, which is extraordinary. And the other piece of that is what we do know is that if kids spend more than 6 hours a day on cell phones, they tend to be more irritable, more distractible. They tend to have more disrupted sleep patterns and lower academic levels. So administrators have really been pointing to this as saying this is starting to disrupt the school day. If you talk about the average high school classroom hallway, what you used to see before we had over 30 states that had some version of a ban or restrictions that have been imposed this year, is that, kids were basically on their phones in class. So teachers were saying that, some teachers were getting so frustrated that they were threatening even to quit because they would say that I can't get the kids' attention. The kids are on the phones all day. I asked the kids to put the phones away and we don't have a rule where they have to do it. And so some will be compliant and others will not. You also have a situation where many parents are actually the people who want their kids to have the phones. So the parents are the ones who have said in many situations, we want to make sure for school safety reasons and other reasons that we have access to our kids all day. One of the other things that happened in the pandemic is that parents had a bird's eye view of what was happening in the classroom because they were having the classrooms in their homes. And so parents could see what was happening in the classroom all day long with classmates. And when kids went back to school, some parents still wanted that access to see what was happening in classrooms. So part of the other reason why I think administrators are saying that they wanted to have these bans and these cell phone restrictions is because they wanted to retake on the role of in loco parentis. Right now, what you've had is that parents were really going more alongside of schools and saying, well, maybe I don't want you to have full in loco parentis all day long. I want to see what's happening in my kid's classroom all day as well. And so there's been some wrangling, I think a little bit of a power struggle between schools and parents about who's really in charge of my kid during the school day.
What is that instinct? I mean, I think about, I'm not a father of teenagers. I'm a father of an elementary school child and a daycare child.
Oh, you've got a ways to go then.
I know. I'm just getting out of the wiping butts phase of things. My kid just potty trained like a couple weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And I get the urge to like want to know everything. And then part of me also feels like, I would have shuddered to have my parents constantly watching me in middle school and high school, because like you kind of have to figure out how to be your own person. You make mistakes, you do dumb stuff, people do dumb stuff to you, like, and so long as that doesn't breach the bounds of true impropriety, like that's kind of the part of growing up. How much of this is really about parents' relationships to their kids?
Yeah, right. So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit with that, right? We've had, because of the pandemic, parents have become much more, it has leveled the relationship a little bit between parents and kids. It has not been as hierarchical, partly because kids and parents were spending so much time together. And so what you begin to see is that when school reopens, that hierarchical relationship has to shift again. And so some parents still want to have that level of closeness with their kids all day, and they use the cell phone. They're texting them all day. Some parents are using their cell phones to say, hey, I'll pick you up after school, or I'll meet you at the baseball field at X time. But then in other situations, you do have parents who are more hovering, more helicopter, parents that are being more involved all day and want to be more involved all day. So schools, I think, have said, listen, we have a role, we have a responsibility. And so we need to make sure that cell phones have a place in your kid's life, but we have to put guardrails around the time that happens. So I do think that some parents probably are very unhappy about having to push this back, but above and beyond just having that parental relationship be a reason for that. There have also been some very real school safety issues, right? So when we've had school shootings last September, I remember in Georgia, there was a school shooting and you could see parents right away saying, hey, I got in contact with my kid. And so parents said they would cite that moment as a reason why they were against having cell phone bans. So schools had a little bit of work to do in districts and legislatures in trying to make sure that parents understood that even in those school safety incidents, that there was a process to make sure that kids were safe and that they could get connected to their families, even in the event of an emergency.
Hmm. I want to get more to some of the unintended consequences, but give us a sense of what happens now when a school decides to ban a phone. What have we found out about the impact on learning, on socialization, on child contentment and behavior? What are we learning from these real-time experiments in terms of these choices to ban or curtail phone use?
So the first thing I would say is that there has not yet been a gold standard that has been established around randomized controlled trials to say definitively that banning cell phones have improved academic outcomes by X% or that it has improved mental health outcomes by Y%. One of the big arguments for why people feel that the cell phones need to be banned is because we've seen, these increases in depression and anxiety, suicidal ideation, especially amongst our young people. Mental health issues have really skyrocketed as a result of the pandemic, and cell phones are often pointed to as a primary contributor to this. So people really feel that taking the cell phones out of kids' hands during the school day is a way to cut down on that. But I do think we need to do more research to confirm that and make sure of that. Because what I really have a concern about is, school is 6.5 hours a day. And so if kids, even if, your district has a bell to bell ban, like New York City has instituted a bell-to-bell ban. Other districts have a ban. Montgomery County in Maryland has a ban that's during instructional periods, but you can have access to your phone during lunch. But the real issue is what happens when the kids leave school, right? What happens after they get the phones back? And we know that kids are getting about 60 notifications during the school hours, but a day. You and I and everyone else who has these cell phones, we're getting about 240 notifications a day, emails, game updates, something new to add to a game, for example. So all of these little updates that are happening all day long, and we're checking Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram. If that's happening during the school day, that's distracting. And even though the cell phone bans are important for the school day, we also need to be thinking beyond the school day now. Right? What is a good amount of time that after the school day, kids can engage in this? We also are a culture right now that has expended a lot of energy on liking negative behaviors. So we also need to think about how we can really put some guardrails again around some of these negative behaviors so that young people are learning how to responsibly engage with this technology.